Welcome, wanderers of the sleepless hours. Tonight, we glide through velvet drapes, gilded corridors, and into a world where every breath carried power, where fragrance was weapon, whisper, and worship. This is the perfumed court of Versailles, the most scented place on earth in the 17th and 18th centuries, where royalty didn't just wear power, they wore it in scent. So settle in, adjust your pillows, let your body loosen its grip on the day, and drift with me, not just into history, but into a history you can inhale. The year is 1675. The man of the hour is Louis XIV, the Sun King, resplendent, radiant, and absolutely reeking of tuberose and ambergris. Versailles, still a former hunting lodge turned palace in progress, is under transformation, not just of brick and marble, but of smell, because the royal court, for all its brocade and pomp, had a stench problem, and not a small one. Hygiene, in the modern sense, was a curiosity rather than a commitment. Baths were rare, water was feared, and bodies were well expressive. The scent of power was not metaphorical, it was literal. It clung to wigs, ruffles, and every swish of satin. Skirts. In response, France didn't just embrace perfume, it turned it into policy. Enter the court perfumers. These were not merely merchants, they were chemists, confidants, and sometimes spies. They had the ear of kings and the pulse of queens, and their work was alchemy, not the turning of lead into gold, but the turning of sweat into sandalwood, the disguising of illness with jasmine, the replacing of filth with florals so intense, so concentrated, they burned more than they bloomed. Each day at court began with a ritual of transformation. The dressing of the king was a ceremony, watched by nobles and dignitaries, and scent played its part. Hands were rubbed with scented waters, faces dusted with powdered violet, wigs perfumed with bergamot oil. Each strand made less of hair and more of theatre. It wasn't cleanliness, it was illusion. But in Versailles, illusion was everything. Walk down the hall of mirrors, and you'd think of grandeur. But what hung in the air wasn't just power or politicking, it was perfume. Lilac, rose, civet, musk. Invisible trails mapped the hierarchy of the court. You could tell who was coming by the scent left behind. The Dauphin, clove, and orange peel. Madame de Montespan, amber and narcissus. The Queen, a guarded mix of almond, verbena, and white lilies. Her personal signature, her olfactory armor, perfume, was identity. And in a palace of 10,000 people, it was also survival. Now imagine a day at Versailles. The heat swells. The courtiers gather in lace and velvet. There is no plumbing, no ventilation. Windows sealed to block the rabble's gaze. Bodies press, corsets restrict, fans flutter. And beneath it all, that unspoken game who can outscent the rest. For this was not just a matter of pleasure. It was politics. The king's mistress, Madame de Maintenon, knew this well. She didn't win favor by beauty alone. She won it with precision. Her signature scent was a mixture of iris root and bitter orange, layered faintly over a soap made with linden blossom. It was understated, thoughtful, a quiet dominance. In a court that often preferred olfactory assault, she whispered her power, and it worked. Perfume makers became weapons dealers in this battle for attention. Recipes were guarded like state secrets. Some perfumers, like Fargin and Lubin, became legends in their own time, entrusted with the sweat-smoothing, mood-calming, ambition-fueling sense of the powerful. They traveled with oils in velvet pouches, vials nestled in hollowed books. and cases disguised as prayer boxes. At night, when the palace finally dimmed and the great windows opened to let in the cooling air, another ritual began, the airing of the wigs, powdered with orris root and cedar. The wigs were hung from hooks, their curls perfumed anew. In the soft hush of twilight, the air shimmered with the residue of musk and immortelle, like memories too delicate to speak aloud. And not all perfumes were gentle. Some were aggressive, spicy with cinnamon or sharp with camphor. Some smelled of smoke and shadow, worn by noblemen who wanted to seem dangerous. A prince might choose an extract of black pepper and dried vetiver root. A duchess might carry a pomander shaped like a golden apple, stuffed with cloves and thyme, designed to repel both illness and rivals. Even illness had a smell. The royal physicians, stuck somewhere between science and guesswork, believed that disease could be smelled before it struck. If the queen's chambers smelled of lavender and rue, all was well. But if the scent turned sour, tinged with decay or too much frankincense, whispers would begin. Was she ill? Was she dying? Did the roses hide a rot beneath? The perfumed court didn't just cover up the truth, it sculpted new ones. A noble woman might wear the scent of a fruit never grown in France. A diplomat might wear attar of roses from Persia, signaling influence. The royal guards even wore matching sachets, their uniforms laced with tonka bean and leather, as if loyalty could be bottled and worn. But nowhere was scent more important than seduction. The art of the courtly affair was a ballet of glances and proximity. You didn't just charm with words, you wafted. Perfumed gloves were popular among the flirtatious goatskins soaked in scented oils, dried over weeks until the leather itself exhaled secrets. A lover might send a handkerchief, drenched in heliotrope, as a silent invitation. A rendezvous in the gardens could be signaled with just a hint of rose water, and still the perfumes evolved by the time of Louis XV. The court was known across Europe, not for its armies, but for its scents. His court was nicknamed La Cour, Parfumi, the perfumed court. Perfume wasn't a fashion, it was a national obsession. Entire towns like Grasse were devoted to its making. Flower fields stretched across the countryside, not for beauty, but for harvest. Orange blossom at dawn, jasmine under moonlight, roses picked by hand, each petal destined for a bottle that might be held, briefly, by a queen. But behind every scent was also shadow. Some ingredients were dangerous. Civet was scraped from glands of wild cats. Musk harvested from deer. Ambergris, prized above all, came from the guts of whales, hardened and tossed ashore by the sea like some divine offering. And the more exotic the origin, the more potent. The perfume's power that could intoxicate, influence, seduce, or kill. Because perfume, like all tools of the court, had its darker uses. A vial could conceal poison. A locket might carry a narcotic. A perfume too heady might induce fainting, or madness, or worse. There were rumors, always rumors, of perfumed letters that brought death, of gloves that carried more than secret, of women who vanished after embracing a duke who smelled too sweet, too sudden, too strange. But rumors are the smoke of history. What we know is this: the court of Versailles was a place of performance, and perfume was its most subtle stagecraft. With scent, one could erase a truth, conjure a myth, rewrite the air itself. And so tonight, as you lie still, imagine those golden halls, not as silent museums, but as breathing, pulsing, aromatic realms. Picture a world where every footstep left a floral ghost, where power wasn't spoken, It was smelled, and the next time you catch a whiff of jasmine, or rose, or a memory wrapped in bergamot, ask yourself, what story does it tell? Because at Versailles, every fragrance was a story, and every story was a secret. Let the scent linger as you drift, because we are not yet finished with the perfumed court. Close your eyes now, breathe slowly. The memory of roses still lingers. The faint trace of jasmine is still caught in your hair. But beneath the bloom, something darker stirs. Tonight, we step beyond the polished mirrors and into the corners. Versailles tried to keep hidden where perfumes were not just pleasure, but peril, where scent seduced, but also silenced, in the gilded heart of Louis XIV's court, where every gesture echoed centuries of pageantry. A war was being waged, not with swords, but with scents. Behind the powdered faces and fanned whispers, an invisible battlefield unfolded daily. The weapons were subtle. A stolen vial, a lingering fragrance, a perfume with one drop too many of. Something else. Let's begin in a private chamber. No windows, heavy velvet drapes, a low burning brazier. The scent, at first, is comforting. Cedar, nutmeg, a trace of immortelle. But then something shifts. The air thickens. A courtier coughs quietly. The heat of the coals releases more than fragrance. This isn't just a perfume. It's a formula. Because at Versailles, chemistry and court politics were twins, and in the shadows of the perfumer's lab, nothing was off limits. Among the royal perfumers, few wielded as much whispered power as Catherine de Chaise, known better to history as La Voisin. Officially, she sold perfumes, potions, and love charms to the ladies of court. Unofficially, she orchestrated a network of apothecaries, fortune-tellers, and poisoners. Her clientele, wives seeking inheritance, mistresses chasing favor, enemies hoping for silence. Her tools were not just herbs and oils. They were motives and secrets. La Voisin's perfumes were works of art and murder. She could lace a sachet with belladonna, slip mandrake into a soap, or brew a rosewater tincture infused with powdered arsenic, so finely ground it would vanish on the skin, leaving only a delicate fragrance, and decline. At court, death came in silks and sweetness. The affair of the poisons, as it came to be known, exposed this rot beneath the rose. Between 1677 and 1682, dozens of nobles were investigated. Some confessed to purchasing inheritance powders. Others were caught sending perfumed letters, scented, yes, but also soaked in fatal tinctures. Even Madame de Montespan, once the king's favorite, found herself dragged into the smoke of suspicion. It was said she commissioned love spells, hired La Voisin, even attended black masses where infants were sacrificed over a perfumed flame. No solid proof was found, but in Versailles, proof was rarely necessary. The scent of scandal was enough. The king was furious, not at the murders, but the exposure. Versailles was supposed to smell of divinity, not deceit. So the crackdown began. Perfume shops were raided. Alchemists vanished. La Voisin herself was burned at the stake in 1680, and with her, many of the darkest perfume recipes disappeared into flame. But the memory lingered. Even after the scandal cooled, caution wafted through the palace. Perfumes were still worn, still loved, but their makers were watched more closely. Recipes were logged, ingredients examined, and yet the game continued, because perfume was still power. By the time Louis XV took the throne, the court had doubled down on scent. His personal apartments were saturated with floral waters, orange blossom, and ambergris. His lovers, and there were many, were each gifted their own signature perfumes, and no one wore it more daringly than Madame de Pompadour. She understood the court better than any minister, understood that in Versailles, intimacy wasn't spoken, it was wafted. Her perfume, carefully crafted with rose, jasmine, and a hint of cardamom, was a masterpiece. But more than that, she used perfume like language, to soothe, to summon, to warn. She once sent the queen a bouquet of lavender, wrapped in a silk scarf, perfumed with violet, a message of submission, perhaps, or supremacy. No one knows for sure. But the queen never questioned her again. Pompadour was more than a mistress. She was a strategist. She funded chemists, invested in perfumers, helped build the city of Grasse into the capital of the perfume world. She didn't just wear scent. She shaped its future, and in the salons of Versailles, others followed. Perfumed gloves were standard now, soaked in amber or rosemary, depending on the season. Fans were dabbed with musk. Even the snuff carried fragrances, tobacco leaves rolled with hints of patchouli or cinnamon. The rooms, however, still stank. 10,000 people lived, worked, and schemed in Versailles. The latrines overflowed, the hallways echoed with bodies and breath, but the perfumes made it bearable. They gave illusion, a theatre of civility, a mask for decay. But not all smells were hidden in the Queen's cabinet of fragrance. A room reserved for Marie Antoinette's private use. Decades later, perfumes were kept like heirlooms. Glass vials, gilded bottles, ceramic dishes of wax. She had her own perfumer, Jean-Louis Fargin, who crafted scents that told stories. Her favorite, a blend called Le Bouquet de la Reine, with rose, jasmine, and iris, light, feminine, a countryside fantasy inside palace walls. When she walked through the Petit Trianon, her retreat from the politics of court, the scent drifted behind her like a rebellion in bloom. But fantasy had limits. The revolution crept closer, and as the perfume makers stirred their pots, adding drops of ylang-ylang and tincture of violet outside, the people grew restless. Bread was scarce, heads were turning. Perfume, once a symbol of divine right, was beginning to reek of excess. In the final days of the monarchy, perfume was not abandoned. It was clung to. Nobles fled with bottles wrapped in linens. Servants wept as they stole sachets. And when the gates of Versailles closed for the last time, the halls still smelled of something sweet, like a memory rotting beneath rose petals. Later, historians would ask, was Versailles truly as perfumed as the legends say? Did courtiers really scent their letters, their gloves, their wigs? The answer is yes, and more, because in a palace where reality was harsh, scent was escape. It was the fantasy that power was eternal, that silk could hold back revolution, that jasmine and neroli could mask the scent of fear. But scent is fleeting. It dances, it deceives, it disappears. And yet, some say Versailles still breathes. That when the wind shifts just right and the sun hits the marble at dusk, a faint trace of rose and musk lingers in the air, as if the perfumed court refuses to fade, as if the walls themselves remember so. Breathe deeply now as the echoes of that vanished world settle into your thoughts. Let the scent guide you toward stillness, toward sleep, toward the next chapter yet to unfold, because the story of the perfumed court is far from over. A drizzle tapped gently against the high mullioned windows of the Spanish court, each drop threading time into memory, as if the very air around Princess Joanna sought to hush her. Valladolid lay under a curtain of grey. Outside, the autumn leaves curled in brittle spirals, and the wind carried with it the murmurs of cloaked courtiers walking carefully through damp courtyards. But within the long tapestried halls of the Alcazar, her every step echoed as if the palace, too, waited to exhale. Joanna was no longer the uncertain girl who had left Flanders. The weeks since her arrival had marked her, not with harshness, but with a quiet hardening, a resolve born of disillusionment. She had come expecting to find a father ready to shield her, to grant her place and voice. But Ferdinand, ever the shrewd monarch, had aged into something flintier. His council rooms were filled with men who bowed low but watched her too closely, measuring her silences, waiting for missteps. Her husband, Philip, had remained in Flanders, writing short letters signed with duty but lacking warmth. Spain, her homeland, no longer felt familiar. Her mother, Queen Isabella, had retreated further into her prayer chambers. Illness took her voice in fragments on. Some days she spoke clearly, on others not at all. She looked upon Joanna with loving eyes, but her strength, the very force that had held kingdoms together, flickered like candlelight. The court whispered Joanna might soon become the future sovereign of Castile. The notion was less a coronation than a storm cloud. Ferdinand, though aging, had no intention of relinquishing power. He cloaked his control behind regency, behind law and duty, but Joanna could see the careful game being played. And it was here, in these halls of subtle glances and cryptic Latin phrases, that she learned the politics of presence, when to walk slowly through court gardens so that the ladies of Seville would catch her gaze, when to appear at mass in silks, woven in Granada, signaling quiet allegiance to the Reconquistad's southern heartland. Her chambers had changed. She had instructed the tapestries of saints to be replaced with Flemish scenes of nature, pale swans on still lakes, fat herons staring. From golden reeds, the scent of Castilla's dry wood had been mixed with oils from Bruges. Her maids, a mix of Spanish and Flemish women, whispered stories of both courts while brushing her hair by candlelight. The language barrier still echoed at times Flemish mutterings, misunderstood by Andalusian ears, but Joanna had become a bridge, not torn by the tension but shaped by it. Yet the court's unease deepened. There were rumors that Philip would come soon to assert his claim. Joanna's husband, crowned Duke of Burgundy and called the Handsome by eager chroniclers, was no mere consort. He was heir to the Habsburg legacy, a house that towered across Europe. But in Spain, power did not bow easily. Ferdinand saw in Philip a rival, not a son-in-law. One afternoon, as the chapel bells tolled the hour of none, a letter arrived under seal of the Habsburg Lion. Joanna opened it alone in her solar, near the window where pale pigeons huddled against the rain. The parchment was creased, the script neat but cold. He would come, with ships, with ministers, with coin. He spoke not of reunion, but of courts, of titles, of governance. He spoke as if Spain were already his dot. Joanna let the letter fall to her lap. The silence in the room grew tight. A distant servant dropped, a pitcher far down the corridor. The sound shattered like brittle glass across the tile. She rose, slow and stately, the movement of a woman no longer tethered to dreams but to consequences. Her breath was steady, her face unreadable. The days grew shorter. October's chill reached into the bones of Valladolid's old stone walls. With each sunrise, envoys arrived bearing more missives, more subtle threats. Philip's ministers demanded audience with the Cortes. They called him King Philip the First before Isabella had even drawn her final breath. The audacity did not go unnoticed. In her private moments, Joanna turned to books. Her mother's prayer books were filled with marginalia scribbled notes in Latin, maps of saints' relics hidden in foreign chapels. But it was the chronicles that drew Joanna's heart. The tales of Queen Urraca, who ruled despite scandal, who bore both crown and defiance, lingered in her thoughts. She read by lantern until her eyes blurred, until her fingers trembled with resolve she could not name. The Queen's health faltered further. Doctors spoke in cautious tones, speaking of humours, of rest, of the blessings of saints. Joanna sat by her bedside, brushing her fingers over Isabella's papery hands. Sometimes, her mother would speak of battles long past, of Granada, of the Alhambra burning under Castilian banners. On other nights, she whispered things only Joanna could understand. Warnings, counsel, half-prayers. You must be both sword and veil. Isabella once murmured, breath catching in her throat, let them see only what you permit. Rule from silence. Then, on the third night of Advent, bells rang not for prayer but for passing. Queen Isabella, the Lioness of Castile, had died just before the snow began to fall. The palace fell into ceremonial mourning. Black drapery cloaked the colonnades. Masses were said in every city from Toledo to Cordoba. 1,000 candles flickered for her soul, and in that space between grief and succession, everything changed. Ferdinand moved swiftly. He summoned notaries. He invoked clauses buried deep in charters. He declared himself regent until Joanna was deemed fit. Fit. The word hung heavy in every room, echoed on every staircase. Her fitness, her soundness, her mind, these were the weapons now used against her. The court, sensing shift, turned like leaves on the wind. Some bent toward Ferdinand's banner, secure in his age and legacy. Others watched Joanna with curiosity, with subtle bows and whispered inquiries. She did not weep publicly. She did not falter. She dressed in deep mourning but kept her chin lifted. Every morning she walked the palace corridors in silence. Her presence alone an act of rebellion. By candlelight she began to pen letters of her own long, elegant responses to Philip, not meek or deferent, but calculated. She addressed him as consort. She offered arrival dates and protocols. She asked pointed questions about courtly behavior, about alliances, about intentions. The return letter, when it came, was longer, warmer. He spoke of missing her presence, of the need for unity, of the rumors he dismissed regarding her instability. He would come, he wrote, in spring. He would kneel beside her throne. They would rule together. But the courtiers in Valladolid were less easily convinced. Murmurs grew louder, whispers of erratic behavior, of spells of melancholy, of midnight, vigils in chapel corners, of conversations with portraits. Every action, no matter how ordinary, was reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. One evening, under flickering torchlight, she entered the great hall where Ferdinand received the Castilian nobles. Silence fell as she crossed the stone floor. Her gown was jet black velvet, embroidered with the crowned lions of Leon and Castile. She wore no jewels, save a single ring Isabella's signet. She stood before the gathered lords and spoke. My mother's crown lies not in question, she said, voice level, echoing with the cadence of royal blood. I am her daughter, rightful Queen of Castile. I do not ask, I declare. And then she bowed to no one, turned, and walked away. Outside, the wind was rising. Across Europe, ambassadors adjusted their letters. Philip prepared his fleet. The sea between Flanders and Spain churned with rumours, and in the cold chambers of Valladolid, Queen Joanna lit a candle in her mother's chapel and stared into the flame until it blinked. The Queen had passed, but the game had only just begun. The sky over Westminster had paled to a dusky blue, when the smell of freshly inked parchment drifted through the corridors of Whitehall Palace. Paper, sealed in wax and tightly wound with ribbon, carried the newest whisper from the chambers of caught a whisper that crept through the capital, tracing its path from the taverns of Fleet Street to the silence of Lambeth's gardens. London, in all her breath and bustle, stirred to the beat of a quiet question. What truly passed in the shadows behind the Queen's furrowed brow? The Queen Anne of Great Britain sat, alone by her window, her hand resting softly on the windowsill, fingers curled over the pale edge of lace that framed the leaded glass. It was 1708, and she had reigned for 7 years, a reign both harrowing and hesitant. She watched the street lanterns flicker to life, one by one, lit by boys with long poles and quick feet. The lights stuttered across cobblestones and rooftops, over the carriages of noblemen and the crates of fishmongers, settling into a yellow hush across the city. Yet peace did not stretch inside her mind. Her eyes round, liquid, and dark tracked a single horse-drawn coach moving slowly down the Mall. Its wheels echoed over the stone like a funeral drum. No crest adorned its doors, no trumpets announced its passage, but Anne knew who rode within. It was Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, her once trusted companion, her mirror and confidant. Now that bond trembled under the weight of silences and accusations unspoken. For years, Sarah had held Anne's heart in her gloved hand. Now that glove had grown cold, far from the Queen's chamber. In a quieter room tucked behind the tapestries of St. James's Chapel, a man dipped a quill into black ink and recorded a list of names. He wrote carefully, glancing every so often toward the heavy velvet curtain drawn across the window. His name was Lionel Brown, a mid-level official in the office of the Lord Chamberlain, tasked with managing court expenditures and correspondence. But he had become something else, keeper of a ledger that never saw the light of day, a register of secret meetings and discreet payments that the public would never know. In that same moment, just 3 corridors away, 2 footmen carried a crate of golden tableware to a service room. As they set the heavy box down with a grunt, one of them, Thomas, barely 20 years of age, leaned close to his companion and whispered, "They say she's making a list. The Queen is. A list of those she keep and those she won't." The other footman scoffed, but his brow tensed. Even the lowest servants felt the electricity of change in the air. It was not only the Queen's friendships unraveling like pulled thread, but her health, too. Her legs swelled often now, and the heat of midsummer brought a flush to her cheeks that no bomb could cool. Her physicians argued in murmurs in the hall. Bleed her, don't. Apply leeches, no syrups, sleep more, sleep less. But all the while, Anne, daughter of James II, stared out of her window and measured the movement of her enemies in silence. In Parliament, whispers circled like flies around meat. The War of the Spanish Succession drained the treasury. Men like Sidney Godolphin and Robert Harley crossed the marble floor with eyes cast downward and tempers sharpened. The Whigs pressed for continued war, the Tories for peace. Between them stood the Queen, pulled like a chain between dogs. at the Cock and Feathers in Holborn. A group of merchants gathered over pints of dark ale and crusty bread. They argued softly about shipping costs and taxation. But then, as the hour grew late, one of them leaned forward. "Have you heard," he asked, "that the Marlboroughs send gifts to Hanover?" The others frowned. Hanover, where the elector's son were to George, the next in line by Protestant succession. If Anne died childless, as seemed increasingly likely, it would be he who inherited her crown. The merchants passed glances among each other like contraband. No one trusted who might be listening. In London, ears were everywhere, south of the city. In a modest home nestled in Richmond Park, a woman named Abigail Hill paced her drawing room. Her dress was plain, her hands modest, but her heart beat with a rare rhythm, ambition. Once cousin to Sarah Churchill, Abigail had crept steadily upward in the Queen's favour. Quiet, clever, and devoid of scandal, she listened when the Queen needed solace, obeyed when the Queen demanded silence. Now it was her name on the Queen's lips in the late hours, not Sarah's, and Sarah knew it. Letters arrived daily in the royal household, some addressed with pompous wax seals. Others smuggled in, rolled beneath the caps of couriers. One such note reached Sarah Churchill herself. The ink on its edges was smudged by haste. The words were sharp. "She is replacing you. She keeps Abigail now for all the hours you once held." Sarah's hands trembled as she read it. She did not cry, she did not scream, but she did summon her scribe and dictated a reply stern, cold, final. The next day it was delivered to the Queen in a silver tray. Anne read the letter in her chamber, her lap covered in a blanket of violet wool. She read it once, then again. Then she folded it slowly, placed it in a drawer, and locked it away. Meanwhile, the city moved on. The Thames rolled brown and steady beneath the arches of London Bridge. Street hawkers bellowed the prices of cherries and eels. Children waded barefoot in the gutters. Sailors haggled for whores in Wapping. The city did not pause for politics. But even among the noise, something had changed. A sense of watching, of waiting. Within the Tower of London, guards whispered of keys that turned too late at night, of visitors not logged, of messages carried without stamps. A quiet clerk named James Rivington, responsible for logging every royal prisoner and visitor, had begun a private record of his own. He had noticed Patton's names reappearing, weeks apart. At odd hours, Churchill's, Harley's, even a Prussian, by the third week of August. The heat had thickened to a syrup, and in the royal chapel, candles bent in their holders. Anne sat stiff, in her pew, flanked by ladies who no longer dared speak during service. Across the aisle, Sarah Churchill's seat remained conspicuously vacant. That absence echoed louder than any psalm sung that morning. It was then that Abigail Hill stepped forward, not with fanfare, not with force, but with soft precision. She helped the Queen from her seat. She held the parasol during the walk. She murmured soft encouragement as the Queen's feet struggled upon the cobbled path. And Anne smiled, the smile of a drowning woman grasping the only hand not trying to push her under. Behind them, high in the chapel's loft, a boy of 13 operated the bellows for the organ. His name was Henry, and he watched them descend, with wide, curious eyes. He did not understand politics, or friendship, or succession, but he felt, deep within his chest, that something important had just shifted, that Abigail Hill had taken a place that could never be given back. Across the Channel, in the Netherlands, the Duke of Marlborough marched still in the Queen's name, winning battles, seizing towns. but letters to London went unanswered. His victories, once celebrated with feasts and cannon fire, were now met with tepid applause and clipped commendations. His wife's letters grew longer, more desperate. In late September, as the leaves in St. James's Park turned gold, a sealed chest was delivered to Kensington Palace. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a portrait Sir Churchill's, painted years before, when her eyes sparkled and her mouth curled with confidence. Anne stared at it for a long time. Then, without speaking, she instructed it be returned to its frame and hung in the deepest hallway of the palace. A hallway no one passed any more, and thus the season turned. The Queen leaned more on Abigail. Sarah vanished from court. Parliament splintered further, and in the still, humid nights of London, the palace whispered not just of war or taxes or treaties, but of loyalty betrayed, of trust broken not with daggers but with ink. The silence that followed in the Queen's chamber was not peace. It was preparation, for the weight of the crown did not lessen it, shifted. And somewhere, behind the eyes of those who bowed, behind the folded hands of servants and ministers alike, thoughts turned toward what would come next. For all could see now. The Queen was aging, childless, isolated, and the throne of England had never stayed empty for long. The curtains of mourning were pulled back gently over the cloaked hills of Perigord, unveiling a landscape still hushed from the hush of twilight. The earth glistened with dew like an offering to the sun, and the trees, old with knowing, creaked softly in the windless hush beneath their patient boughs. Life in the village of St. Croix stirred to the rhythm of wooden shutters creaking open and the rustle of linen against stone. The markets had not yet opened, but the scent of morning bread was already creeping down the winding lanes like a secret dot in the manor on the hill. The Lady Eleanor de Myrmont walked quietly along the gallery of painted saints and ancestral faces. Her slippers made no sound on the tapestried stone. She had dreamt again, a curious thing. In her sleep, she had seen a woman with a silver quill writing not on paper, but across the river's surface, her words floating briefly before melting into ripples. When Eleanor had asked her name, the woman had smiled and vanished. She had woken with her hand still slightly raised, fingers curled as if cradling something unseen. Her steward, Perduro, met her in the solar with news of a peculiar kind. The mason repairing the old fountain had uncovered not earth or root, but a narrow brick tunnel that curved away beneath the chapel wall. It had been sealed by stone laid centuries ago, too even to be accidental. They feared to go further without her word. She gave it now with a nod, her breath catching not from fear, but the same tingling expectation that had gripped her upon first reading the diary of Dame Wyas Abo. By midday, the workers had exposed the tunnel's mouth completely. Moss hung like veils around it, and the stone lips yawned like a gateway in a fable. Perduro blessed the threshold quietly. There was something about the air too cold for summer, and scented faintly like lilac and ink. Eleanor descended first, flanked by two menatams with lanterns. The tunnel curved downward and then straightened into a passage of ancient brickwork, still firm despite the years. They walked for some minutes until the passage widened into a chamber carved directly from the rock, its walls damp but intact, and there, set into the far wall, was a door, iron-strapped, with a symbol etched into its lintel, a triangle within. A circle, the emblem she had seen once on a folded parchment tucked between the diary's last pages. No keyhole, no latch, but when she placed her hand against it, The wood shivered under her palm, and then ... gave. The door swung inward silently within. Nothing moved, but the sense of breath held eternally hung thick. Shelves low, deep, and lined with scrolls, and books bound in soft leather. There were no signs of rats or rot. Time had passed here, certainly, but carefully, respectfully. She stepped inside. Her fingers grazed the bindings, like touching the backs of sleeping birds. These were not merely books. They were records of chants, of recipes, of observations on lunar cycles and herbal purgings, of childbearing rituals, burial customs, and names. Hundreds of names, written in different hands over generations, a lineage of women chroniclers, all bound to this hidden sanctum. Her breath caught on a word, Lucian, a name she knew, and beneath it, Dmiremont. She drew the book closer. It was no mere coincidence. This was her bloodline, winding backward through ink and memory. What the world called lost, her foremothers had merely hidden, with purpose, with care. Later, she sat in the stillness of her solar. The book opened across her lap like a cat that had chosen her. The sun had begun to set. Through the windows, the village bell rang for vespers, and the shadows lengthened like a deepening note. "Tell me," she whispered to the book, tracing the page with one gentle finger, "what did you save us from?" The answer was not immediate, but the wind, which had been still all day, rose then and brushed against the window. The pages turned slowly of their own accord, settling on a passage written in an older dialect, firm and square in its hand. "We are the echoes of the silent ones. We guard not power, but balance. For too long, the world has forgotten how to listen. We were never witches, we were watchers." She closed her eyes. The dreams came again that night, but differently. She saw the woman with the silver quill once more, but this time her face was clearer, familiar, not from paintings, not from memory, but something older, carried in the bones. The woman leaned close and whispered a single phrase in the dream's final moments. "The herb that burns white will show you the sealed name." When Alienor woke, the sky was still grey and soft with the breath of dawn. She sent word to the apothecary before breakfast. Over the next weeks, with the help of Pajuro and the willing curiosity of her steward's granddaughter, Alienor catalogued the books and scrolls. She read not just the words, but the margins, the doodles of plants, symbols of stars, moon charts, and coded recipes. One scroll bore a diagram of the human spine next to a list of incantations written phonetically. Another was a map, not of lands, but of sky, tracking the movement of a comet with red ink that shimmered under candlelight. In the hollow of the wall, behind a row of apocryphal psalms, they discovered a coffer. Within it were bundles of dried herbs, some brittle and nameless, others pungent and strangely preserved. Among them, a small sachet marked with wax, a sigil of flame. It gave off no scent, but when burned in a dish, as the diary instructed, it glowed not red, but white. Snow white, she sat alone that evening, inhaling the smoke as instructed. The dream came sharper now. She stood in a garden of stones, where each flower opened to reveal an eye. The woman with the silver quill no longer wrote, she watched, and behind her others gathered, women of different garb, different centuries. One reached out and pressed a circle into Alienor's palm. When she looked down, the symbol there was not unfamiliar, the triangle in the circle. Again, she woke with a gasp, and when she looked at her palm, there was a faint imprint gone within seconds. like dust swept by breeze, but real in the daylight. She sought out a priest's ledger in the chapel. She asked Père Giraud if she might examine older registers. He hesitated, but yielded. In a drawer, long untouched, they found names scratched into parchment with quills long gone to Ashdod there. Among them, Isabeau, Lucien, and one more, Meili, stated 12 for 7. Next to it, in red, condemned, interred. But there was no record of her burial. In the village cemetery, Aliénor stared at the parchment for a long time. History had its habits. It wrote what served it, but beneath, alongside, and between, there were other scribes. The wind picked up again that evening, and the windows whispered open. She stood at the balcony, the diary in one hand, the dried white herb in the other. The past was not gone. It had merely hidden its face, behind doors, beneath wells, and within the breath of women who would not be erased. Tomorrow she would ride to the ruined tower, where Dame Meili's was said to have been taken. The answers were not in books alone. Some lived in stone, and some, she now knew, waited in dreams. As the muffled peal of bells faded across the domed skyline of Renaissance Florence, the shadowed cloisters of Santa Croce cooled beneath the dwindling gold of evening. A hush had fallen over the piazza outside, save for the faint shuffle of sandals on stone as Brother Domenico made his silent rounds. He carried no lantern, he did not need one. The paths beneath the cypress trees were etched into his feet after decades of quiet repetition. But tonight, something in the stillness felt expectant, like parchment waiting for ink, beneath vaulted ceilings and frescoed saints. Behind cloistered gardens and iron-bound doors, an old manuscript lay unrolled on a walnut desk. Ink still glistened. On its lower margin, it was a copy and exquisite, one of a treatise said to have been dictated by the last librarian of Alexandria. It had passed, rumor claimed, from monk to Moor to merchant to Medici, across generations. And now it sat in the candlelight, open to a page of peculiar geometry and symbols drawn in scarlet. Ink instead of the usual black. The Medici archivist, who had smuggled it here, had done so under the pretenses of religious preservation. Yet those who had seen it whispered otherwise, that the red ink was not ink at all, that the page it rested upon had a strange resistance to fire and moisture, that if one stared too long at the diagram in the margins, their dreams would no longer remain their own in the scriptorium above. Nestled behind carved stone columns, Sister Elisabetta leaned over the open volume with a magnifier clasped in silver. Her breath clouded the glass now and then. A full moon glowed beyond the stained glass window, filtered through sapphire and rose-tinted panels that danced across the page like reverent spirits. But Elisabetta was not praying. She was deciphering. Her mind moved in layers first, the Latin marginalia, then the symbols, then the rhythmic cadence of the prose. Her brow furrowed. The text described a gate knot of iron or wood, but of frequency and light, harmonics which, when replicated in chant or breath or thought, could unlock something deeper than memory, a kind of archive, hidden not in a building but in the very silence between heartbeats. Downstairs, Brother Domenico paused beneath an arch. He could smell candle wax and a faint char in the air like the aftershock of lightning or a hearth long since extinguished. The inner doors of the monastery were closed, but not locked. That was the first detail he noticed. The second was a distant sound of thrum, very faint, like the taut string of a lute slowly tightening. He blinked into the gloom. The sound was not coming from outside. It came from within the walls. Back in the scriptorium, Elisabetta had begun to hum. She did not realize she was doing it at first. The melody matched the symbols phonetically, visually. She hummed the spacing between the glyphs, the rising cadence of the inked markings, and as she did, the red pigment on the page seemed to pulse, subtly at first, then more vividly. It did not glow, there was no radiant light, but there was a shimmer, like oil on water, barely perceptible and wholly unnatural. She stopped. Her breath caught at that exact moment in the reliquary chamber 2 floors below. A sealed cabinet shifted with a muffled click. No one heard it. No one should have, for it had not been opened in 400 years. The manuscript, known only as the Meridian Codex, had been partially copied, partially decrypted. Its contents, however, remained misunderstood, for the Codex did not contain secrets in the sense of political intrigue or theological debate. Its secrets were of origin and repetition patterns embedded in ancient rituals long dismissed as superstition. But the Medici had understood. They always had. Lorenzo de' Medici had once commissioned the duplication of the Codex not to hide its truths, but to distribute them. In coded frescoes, in the alignments of basilicas, in the proportions of bridges and palazzi. Florence itself had been mapped to mirror the harmony described within the manuscript, its roads and piazzas, its fountains and towers. Those who walked its streets walked upon a score of music too old to hear, too vast to understand. And Elisabetta, now humming, again was retracing the harmony. From behind her, a faint draught moved through the scriptorium. The window was shut. The air should have been still. She turned slowly. The candle flames swayed slightly toward the center of the room. That meant there was a vacuum, something pulling inward. She rose. The Codex remained open, red lines still throbbing faintly. She moved past the desks, past the locked cabinets and scroll racks, until she reached a carved alcove that held no sculpture, only a flat panel of wood covered in centuries of dust. She had never noticed it before. It did not match the rest of the room. She reached out. Her fingertips brushed the panel and it sang, not in sound, not aloud, but her bones felt it. A resonant chord thrummed down her arms and into her chest, and she reeled back as if struck. For a moment, everything slowed. The frescoes seemed deeper, the colors darker. The shadows lengthened as if dusk had fallen anew. Then silence. Elisabetta stumbled back to the manuscript. But the page had changed. The symbols were the same, but their alignment had subtly rotated. She realized with quiet dread that the Codex was not static. It responded, and it had heard her song. Domenico, far below, now moved with urgency. He had fetched a small crucifix and an oil lamp. His face, usually composed, bore creases of alarm. Something in the air felt ancient, not demonic, but vast. He climbed the steps, murmuring Latin prayers under his breath, more out of habit than conviction. When he reached the scriptorium, the door was ajar. Elisabetta sat motionless, eyes fixed on the Codex. She did not blink. "Child," he said gently. "You've been chanting." She nodded. "Once. You must stop." "I can't," she whispered. "I haven't begun." Outside, a wind had risen. Florence, under the cloak of night, shifted in its sleep. In the highest bell tower, a crow landed and cawed once, its wings twitching like a marionette stirred by unseen hands. A clock struck midnight, and the chimes echoed differently deeper, more hollow in Rome. Meanwhile, beneath the marble bones of the Vatican Library, An old man in red robes stirred from his writing desk and walked toward a sealed vault. He, too, had felt it. Not the humming, not the symbols, but the shift. The codex had awakened, and it would not sing to just one voice. In the damp undercroft of Santa Croce, beneath centuries of burial and sanctified earth, old bones began to stir. Not with resurrection, not with horror, but with memory. The kind of memory not stored in the mind, but in the structure of time itself. A memory etched into rhythm and ritual. Florence was listening, and history, as always, was waiting to be heard once more. At the first whisper of dusk, the bells of the church of Saint Sauveur rang with a solemn echo through the crooked streets of old Montségur. The notes, deep and resonant, fell upon rooftops tiled in rust-red clay and passed over timbers that remembered both laughter and blood. A hush fell across the village. Shopkeepers paused as they folded their shutters. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. The wind stilled, as though the hour itself awaited something unspoken in a stone-walled chamber at the heart of the town. Behind a great oak door, bound with iron hinges rusted by time, sat Brother Emmerich, his robes of humble wool gathered around, his ankles like moss at the base of a tree. A candle flickered beside a faded parchment map pinned upon the wall, one not of Montségur, but of the hidden valleys behind it. Valleys whispered about in catechisms too old for papal consent. Valleys where the grass grew silver in moonlight and the bones of poets, rebels, and mystics were said to sing if the wind passed just right. Brother Emmerich traced a finger along the old border. His hands bore the ink stains of scholarship and the small scars of one who had once turned sword into plough. Yet tonight no book rested upon his knee, no psalm on his lips. His eyes lingered on a single dot upon the map annex, no bigger than the head of a pin. Beneath it, barely visible under the candle's glow, read a word in Occitan, Belhistar, the beautiful remnant. For centuries, Belhistar had remained a secret only spoken among the Cathar faithful, those who had survived the pyres, inquisitions, and betrayals. They called it a sanctuary beyond even the reach of kings and popes, a place where truth was preserved like wine sealed in clay, amphory. And now, Brother Emmerich believed he had found the path to it. He rose quietly, the wooden chair creaking, like an old cello beneath him. From a drawer beneath the table, he retrieved a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were not relics or coins, but 3 ancient codices bound in soft goatskin and inked with ink made from oak gall and vinegar. Each was older than memory and scribed by hands long turned to dust. These, Emmerich believed, would be his offering, his key to Belhester's forgotten gates. Elsewhere in Montségur, under the thatched roof of a farmhouse at the village's edge, young Mahel stirred in her sleep. She had dreamed again of the woman in Greathall, veiled and silent, walking barefoot over stones that glowed faintly beneath her feet. The dream had begun 2 seasons ago, and each night the woman drew closer. Tonight she had stood beside Mael's bed and whispered just one word before vanishing into the black crossing. Mael sat upright, her heart beating like a bird against a cage. The fire in the hearth had died, but a faint blue shimmer pulsed in the room's corners, like fog trapped in moonlight. She stepped to the door and opened it quietly. The air was still, too still. Even the crickets had ceased their song, and in that unnatural silence she heard it, the same 3-toned chime that had haunted her in dreams. It was not the bell of Saint Sauveur. This one was older, deeper, stranger. It came from the western hills, unseen by her at the very edge of the woodlands, a cloaked rider paused. A wax-sealed letter was tucked inside the folds of their tunic. Upon it was inscribed a simple line of Latin: Lux in tenebris lucet, et tenebris in non comprehend. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. The rider pressed forward, hooves muffled on moss and loam, bound for a hidden meeting long in the making. By morning, Brother Emmerich was gone. The townsfolk whispered he had taken to the hills to pray or seek penance, for he had left no note, no sign, only the scent of extinguished candles and a locked study. But Maëlle knew better. That morning, at the edge of the market, a single feather lay atop her basket, long, curved, and silvered like the dreams she feared and longed for in equal measure. She lifted it gently, and as she did, the wind shifted. A low murmur drifted over the rooftops, a voice not hers and not human, saying, "The crossing begins." And so it did, beyond Montsegur, past the ruins of burned abbeys and beneath the roots of trees to ancient forenames. The road unfolded like a ribbon of forgotten hymns. Emmerich rode through the mist-veiled passes, guided not by sun or star, but by the rhythm of memories he had never lived, and the pull of faith he could no longer define. At a stone bridge crumbling with ivy, he met the rider with the sealed letter. No words passed between them, only a nod, and the parchment exchanged hands. That night, beside a fire of applewood and ash, Emmerich read its contents. It was not a letter. It was a map, not one inked in lines, but in verses, symbols, and metaphors. The instructions were not written in directions, but in riddles, each stanza describing a step on a journey designed not only to test geography, but the heart, the memory, and the silence between thoughts. Maëlle, too, had left the village, though none saw her go. She followed the path she'd walked in dreams, down the riverbed with stones like sleeping eyes, through the fog-choked forest where the air trembled with ghost breath. In her satchel she carried no compass, only a comb of carved bonen, heirloom from a grandmother who had once spoken of Belhastar while weaving wool by the fire. For days, Maëlle and Emmerich travelled separately but toward the same place, their paths echoing old liturgies. Neither had studied, but both seemed to remember. And slowly, like mist parting to reveal forgotten peaks, signs appeared. A tree with leaves of mirror glass, a pool that reflected stars no longer in the sky, a fox that watched them from afar, unmoving, as though guarding something sacred. Each sign reaffirmed what the world had forgotten, that there were still sanctuaries hidden in the folds of time, places untouched by empire, industry, or reason. And at last, in a hollow between two limestone ridges, they met. They spoke no words. At first, Maëlle offered the bone comb, Emmerich the codices. Both bowed before the silence, and when they stood, the woman in grey appeared, not veiled this time, but radiant, her eyes deep as wells and old as time. "You have found the crossing," she said. "Now, leave behind what you were." And they did. Behind them, Montsegur fell into sleep once more, its people none the wiser, its bells ringing at dusk, at dawn, forever marking time they could no longer grasp. But in the hidden sanctum of Belhastar, where walls hummed with memory and light danced upon stone as though alive, two new pilgrims began their part in a song older than any scripture. And it was only just beginning. The cypress trees along the Tuscan hills stood darker now, no longer just the silhouettes of sleepy countryside guardians, but watchful obelisks to time itself. As the evening turned to night and night to memory, the villa high above the Arno, river seemed to exhale for the first time in decades. Its stones no longer groaned under the weight of secrets. The wind no longer whispered solely to ghosts. The story, patient in its unraveling, had reached its quiet conclusion. Inside the villa, only the sound of a ticking brass pendulum echoed. It had once belonged to Alessandro Ricci's study, a gift from a Florentine clockmaker, worn smooth by decades of winding fingers and quiet routine. The pendulum, like the villa, like the story itself, had persisted. Across centuries, uprisings, lovers, quarrels, betrayals, masked in perfumed courtyards, and treaties signed under dusk. And now, the ticking remained, alone in its vigil, reminding. The stone walls of what had been. Anna had returned, not as an intruder, nor a tourist, but as the last Ricci in blood and burden. The archive she discovered sealed behind the hidden fresco paintings of grape. Harvesters laughing in eternal pigment contained the journals. Not one, but dozens, from Alessandro, from Claudia, from their descendants. The story had never been lost. It had simply been waiting for the right person to read it without judgment. There was a time when history was written by those who wielded the quill with trembling self-righteousness. But these journals were different. They bore regrets, inked without shame, longing scribbled between lessons in winemaking and trade routes. One revealed the night Claudia nearly escaped with the Venetian painter she loved. Another recorded the illness that took the second-born son whose name vanished from Ricci records. They spoke of war and of peace, of olives and revolutions, of whispered confessions by candlelight. Each page wove itself into a broader understanding of the family legacy, not as nobility, but as people, fragile, flawed, and trying. Anna had transcribed it all, her handwriting a bridge between old and new. She spoke no Latin, but the faded ink was generous. The villa's small library, once dusty with forgotten dogma, became alive again, and as summer stretched out and the moon glowed fuller over the terracotta fields, Anna began to host readings not for scholars, but for locals, children, and elders. She told the story of the Riccis, not as a lesson in aristocracy, but as a meditation on the passage of time. Luca, the gardener's grandson, sat rapt at every telling. It was his hands that had helped Anna remove ivy from the outer wall and rediscover the family crest long erased. In the quiet moments, when the air was thick with rosemary and the fireflies blinked in rhythmic chorus, Luca asked questions others hadn't dared. Why did Alessandro hide Claudia's letters behind oil paintings? Why did the villa's chapel remain unfinished? Why was the marble staircase curved like a shell rather than straight like the Roman style? Each question gave rise to another detail. Each detail another echo. The villa was not a structure, but a memory palace. Beneath every floorboard lived a whisper. Anna listened. The final volume, bound in soft, brittle leather and missing its cover, was penned in a slanted, unfamiliar script. The author was unknown, yet the tone was unmistakably Ricci. It chronicled the family's final winter in the villa before dispersing across Europe. The entry, dated February 14th, 1782, described a final gathering under candlelight, the last wine press, the final harvest supper, the Ricci crest painted onto cakes and banners, and the unspoken certainty that no generation would return again. But one entry stood apart. Dated a year later, in a different hand, it read simply, "We leave behind walls filled with longing and laughter. If time is kind, let them speak again when the world is ready to hear not what we accomplished, but how we loved." Anna closed the journal and rested her hands atop it. In the quiet room, beneath the vaulted ceiling of painted skies and ancient cherubs. She whispered to the ghosts she no longer feared. They're listening now. Outside, Tuscany began to fade into velvet twilight. The same stars that had blinked down upon Claudia's elopement and Alessandro's betrayal now shimmered with no agenda. The villa once weighed with unresolved stories now exhaled fully. It no longer strained under silence. Its breath matched the breeze, its pulse the distant hoot of an owl calling from the olive grove. In the months that followed, the villa became a refuge for storytellers, historians, and night thinkers. Anna did not advertise it. No website, no glossy brochures. Those who needed it arrived by instinct, drawn by dreams, by a name remembered faintly in a university corridor or overheard in a wine cellar. They came not to see artifacts, but to sit in the stillness and feel what it meant to belong to time rather than control it. One evening, an old woman with tremoring hands stood in the villa's hall and traced the edge of a fresco. Her breath caught. My grandmother used to hum this motif, she said. I never knew where it came from. Anna smiled and led her to the journals. The stories did not end. They moved. They traveled in the footsteps of those who walked the corridors and whispered names long buried. The villa did not seek to preserve history in amber. It let it breathe, allowed it to age, mellow and warm like wine in a barrel carved from richy oak. And so, as the final candle flickered and the last journal found its resting place beneath the glass of a repurposed writing desk, Anna closed the shutters one evening and listened. Not for ghosts, not for wind, but for silence, the kind that follows peace. A silence that told her everything had been said, that history, if told with patience and rhythm, could soothe even the loneliest soul to sleep. And high above the Arno, the villa kept watching, kept dreaming, no longer waiting to be remembered, only to be felt.